Hello, my name is Roger Watson. I'm the Professor of Nursing at the University of Hull in the UK. I'm also the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Advanced Nursing and the Editor of Nursing Open. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and address your Congress. I'm really sorry that for reasons of travelling elsewhere I couldn't be with you in person. I also asked a colleague if he could come and speak, but he's also travelling, so sorry neither of us could be there. I know there's no substitute for listening to a live lecture and being able to interact with the lecturer and ask some questions. So what I've done instead is made a YouTube video, but because it's not easy to sit and listen to these for too long, I'm going to try and keep this relatively short. Just to tell you that I've been to Turkey many times. I've never visited your university or your city, but I hope to sometime in future. In fact, I'm only just back from Izmir in Turkey, where I addressed another Congress. What I want to talk to you about today is the importance of graduate nurse education, and following this short introduction there's going to be a short PowerPoint presentation just to give you some facts and figures regarding graduate nurse education. It's a topic that interests me greatly because despite the UK being the first country in the world to have a professional nursing programme instigated over 100 years ago by Florence Nightingale, sadly the UK has rather fallen behind in the development of actual graduate nursing education. That's also despite the fact that in Europe, not counting Turkey, because I think you were ahead of us, but in the rest of Europe, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland in the UK was the first university ever to have a graduate programme in nursing. However, these were small beginnings, and as I say, the UK has lagged far behind in the development of actual graduate nursing education. I just want to trace the history of that briefly before I give the PowerPoint presentation. When I trained as a nurse, and when I mean trained, I do mean trained, I don't really mean educated as a nurse. I trained under the traditional model in a school that was located in a hospital, and that was how we trained for many years, up until around the middle of the 1980s. These hospital-based schools of nursing were really quite small, and almost every hospital, regardless of the size of the hospital, would have some facility for teaching students. However, these were not proper educational programs. They led to a registration which was around the level of a diploma. There was graduate nursing education, as I say. It started in 1960 at the University of Edinburgh, but the number of graduate nurses was very, very small. There was research to show that graduate nurses were very effective in the sense that they stayed in the profession longer and that they didn't always stay in the acute areas of care. Many of them worked with older people and worked in the community. Contrary to the expectations, people assumed that they would work in the acute technical areas of nursing and also become managers very quickly and move up the ladder, but this wasn't actually the case. So there was some early evidence to show that graduate nurses were good value for money. However, it took a long time to spread graduate education more widely in the UK. So in the middle of the 1980s, the system of nursing education in the UK began to change. There was something called Project 2000. 2000 referred to the year 2000, and what it meant was that by the year 2000 all nursing education would be delivered in a particular way. So around 1987 Project 2000 began to be incepted in the UK, and one of the outcomes of that was that the small schools of nursing in various hospitals were brought together into colleges of nursing, usually located within one major hospital or sometimes in one major educational centre, a local college for example. And this was the pattern for the next few years, and the purpose of Project 2000 was to change the system of nursing education to provide a common foundation programme and then branches off into adult nursing and mental health nursing, midwifery and so forth. So everyone who did nursing came and did that common foundation course. The sort of subliminal reason for Project 2000 was to try and lead towards graduate nursing education. This wasn't always very explicit, but certainly the people who planned Project 2000 had it in mind that eventually nursing education should become all based in university and have a graduate basis for training, but that was a long time in coming. However, before the year 2000, Project 2000 was ended. There were some research projects with mixed results to show whether Project 2000 was really working or not, but certainly the general public and the politicians were not happy with Project 2000. And in 1999, just the year before 2000, a new system of nursing education was brought in called Making a Difference. And this was a plan to have jumping in and jumping off points from nursing education, whereby people who were not necessarily holding the right qualifications to be a nurse but had some experience could enter a nursing programme, and at the other end of the spectrum nurses could become nurse consultants. However, Making a Difference very quickly proved to be not a very good way of educating nurses. It didn't solve some of the issues that people saw with nursing education, and it certainly didn't seem to help us to solve the shortage of nursing that we had. However, what Making a Difference did do was around the end of the 90s and early 2000s, it did in fact move all of nursing education into universities. Universities were responsible for nursing education, but they ran graduate programs in some universities like my own and separate diploma programs, and the diploma programs were often run on completely separate premises, often in a nursing college or in one of the local hospitals. But around the year 2000, all of the nursing education moved into university. Graduate nurses and non-graduate or diploma nurses were taught together. This didn't really work very well, and around the middle of the 2000s, before 2010, a new system called Fitness for Practice was brought in, and there were some changes made to nursing education. The feeling was amongst politicians and the general public that educating nurses in universities wasn't a good thing, that they didn't need to be educated and that they weren't getting enough clinical practice. However, that was a big myth. When I trained as a nurse a long time ago, 50% of my time was spent in clinical practice. When Project 2000 was brought in, 50% of the time there was spent in clinical practice, and it was the same with Making a Difference. That has never changed. So that is one myth. But the public perception of nursing, as I'll cover in my PowerPoint presentation, has always been quite low, and politicians who essentially want to be voted in again at the next election respond to this. Nevertheless, the evidence for graduate nursing education being effective began to filter through, and I'll give you some of that evidence in the PowerPoint presentation. And this did have an influence, and eventually, after a long struggle and against much opposition, the British government and the registration body for nursing, the Nursing and Midwifery Council, made the decision that all of nursing education would be moved on to a graduate footing. And in 2011, all nurses in the UK entering nurse education entered a graduate nursing programme, and in 2013, 3 years later, because we run a 3-year programme in the UK, all nurses qualifying as a nurse and entering the register were graduates. So the change has been achieved. There has been some pressure to move back the other way. There's constant sniping in the UK press about nurses not being fit to practice because they've gone to university and such like. This seems to me to be a unique UK problem. I travel widely in the USA, the Far East, Southeast Asia, the rest of Europe and in Australia, and this very bad attitude towards university educated nurses doesn't really seem to exist. It seems to be unique to the UK. So now all nurses entering nurse education take a degree. That doesn't mean to say that all nurses working in the National Health Service, which is the majority of our health service in the UK, doesn't mean to say that they're all graduate nurses. We still have a long way to go. Many have converted to degree courses, but there are still nurses around who don't have degrees. But eventually, in the years to come, we will have an all-graduate profession. So thank you very much for listening to me so far. I'm going to give a short PowerPoint presentation which is going to cover some of these things and present some of the evidence. Enjoy the rest of the Congress, and I hope to meet you sometime and to visit your university. Goodbye.
The importance of graduate nurse education. My name is Roger Watson. I'm the Professor of Nursing in the University of Hull in the UK. Before we start, I want to show you one of the best sights near my city. This is the Humber Bridge, which crosses the River Humber at over 2 miles long. It's one of the longest suspension bridges in the world. If you come to Hull, which you must do, you'll see this beautiful bridge. This picture here is of 3 very fine ladies who were amongst the first group of graduate nurses from the University of Edinburgh in the UK. And as I mentioned already, the University of Edinburgh was the first university in Europe to have a graduate nursing programme in 1960. These ladies will have graduated around the middle of the 1960s, 1964 or 1965. And here they are at a reunion, something like 40 or maybe 50 years after the start of that programme. The media image of nursing isn't always very positive, and this book by Suzanne Gordon covers this in great detail. It's called Nursing Against the Odds. Suzanne Gordon is not a nurse, she's a journalist, but this book is very worth reading. We tend to be portrayed in the media as angels. This is a very typical picture of an angel. I'm just using it to illustrate the point. So people tend to think that we're angels, we can do no wrong. On the other hand, when things do go wrong, as they did terribly at this particular hospital in the United Kingdom, we're very rapidly portrayed as being devils. So we alternate in the eyes of the media, and therefore in the eyes of the general public, as being either angels or demons. Neither of these pictures is accurate, neither of them is very helpful. We're just human beings who are studying a profession and trying to do our best. But everyone seems to have an opinion on nursing, and I find that really very few people outside of nursing have very much understanding of what nursing is really about. Nurses happen to be one of the most trustworthy professions in the world, depending on which country you go to, the UK, Australia, or the US. This particular survey, I think, comes from Australia, where nurses are consistently rated as the most trustworthy people and the most trustworthy profession, higher than doctors, much higher than lawyers, and very much higher than politicians, which is hardly surprising. So people do have a positive image of nurses generally, but they don't have a very positive image of educated nurses. There's still a feeling that nurses do not need university level education. Now, nurses do have degrees, but this seems to cause difficulty for some people. This is a commentator in the UK called Minette Marin, who writes regularly in one of our newspapers called the Sunday Times, and she has led a consistent and vitriolic campaign against graduate nurses, basically saying all we want to do is have degrees to be equal with doctors, which of course isn't true. They simply refuse to look at the evidence or take that into account. And she really says some terrible things about graduate nurses, all based on some poor experience that she's had in hospital or that she's heard about. Now, bad care and poor experiences are inexcusable, but it's not because nurses have degrees, it's for other reasons. And there's this phrase that constantly comes up in the media in the UK saying that nurses are too posh to wash. In other words, they think too much of themselves because they have degrees in order to look after patients properly. I don't know if this happens in Turkey. I don't think it happens anywhere else in the world. I think it's unique to the United Kingdom. This is another commentator, Theodore Dalrymple. He's actually a doctor. That isn't his real name. He's called Anthony Daniels. Put it there in brackets. He's generally a very good writer about all things medical, legal, and social. However, he really is very, very opposed to nurses having degrees, and basically saying that having degrees is not necessary for nurses. In fact, nurses are not clever enough to have degrees. Specifically, he said, medicine is a university course with a very large element of apprenticeship, but medicine is both a learned profession and a practical art, which nursing is not and is never likely to be. I have no idea why he's saying that, and I don't actually think that medicine should necessarily be compared directly with nursing, but this is what he says anyway. And he goes on to say there's no reason why nursing should not be a university course, but that nurses don't possess the necessary intelligence or learning to be graduates. Really terrible attitude towards nursing. Another commentator, Alison Pearson, in another newspaper, said nurses shouldn't carry the bedpan for this crisis. She meant by this that nurses shouldn't be lumbered or burdened with having degrees. They should just get on with caring for patients. They don't need degrees. She said, making nursing a degree entry profession was a disaster. It was like decreeing that motherhood should be for graduates only. You automatically excluded many of the best and the gentlest candidates. As if anyone really knows what it takes to be a nurse. Well, everybody thinks they do, but they don't really. They think all you need to do is have a good heart and to be a nice person. And of course, these things are probably essential to being a nurse, but there's so much more to it. And she compares nursing with motherhood, which of course is highly inaccurate and of course is very sexist, because not all nurses, as we know, are female. However, I think people can have their own opinion. They're entitled to them, but they're not entitled to their own facts. So what are the facts about graduate nursing education? What is the evidence for graduate nursing education? And I just want to review that briefly here. The Royal College of Nursing in the UK, which is one of our professional bodies, which is also a trade union, commissioned a report by Lord Philip Willis, and it was called the Willis Commission of 2012. And he titled his commission, Report Quality with Compassion, The Future of Nursing Education. And one of the things he specifically looked for was evidence that being graduates or being university educated was poor for nurses. And I was very glad to see that he used some of the evidence that I've happened to generate with colleagues in some of our research projects. Specifically, and unsurprisingly, he found no evidence that there's a conflict between intellect and compassion. And he refers to other commissions, the Francis Commission and his own commission. What neither recommended was that students should spend unqualified and unregulated time and would somehow become good nurses by osmosis. what he specifically recommended was that they need better education. And just to reiterate, he found no evidence that there's a conflict between being educated and having an intellect and being a caring nurse. And in fact, that's true. There is no evidence for that, as you would expect. There's no reason to think that if you have an intellect and that you're clever and that you have a degree, that you can't care for people. Now, this paper from 2003, headed by Linda Aiken and her team in America, was not the only paper to show this, but it was one of the early papers looking at the educational level of hospital nurses and surgical patient mortality. And this has been a consistent theme in studies of graduate nursing education, looking at whether people survive more in hospital as a result of graduate care compared with non-graduate care. This is a huge study with over 200,000 patients being studied, and the outcomes of those patients related to whether the nurses were graduates or non-graduates. What they found was that in hospitals with higher proportions of nurses educated at baccalaureate level, that's degree level, or higher, in those hospitals, surgical patients experienced lower mortality or failure to be rescued when something went wrong. And this is not the only study carried out by Linda Aiken in the States to show this very, very clearly and very, very strongly. This had a huge influence on policy regarding nurse education in the USA. As reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Institute of Medicine in America issued a report in which it recommended that the proportion of nurses in the US who hold at least a bachelor's degree should be increased from the current level of 50% to 80%. So the medical profession in the USA supports this increase in graduate education for nurses. More recently, in 2014, a study in Europe published in the Lancet. It might interest you to know that this was the Lancet's highest cited paper that year. This is a study which is cross-European and again led by Linda Aiken. You'll see my name down at the bottom there along with a colleague, Alvisa Palese. That's because we reviewed this article for the Lancet, and we also wrote a commentary to accompany it. The study was of over 400,000 patients aged over 50 in 300 hospitals in 9 European countries, and it looked specifically at mortality, again related to various things, including whether the nurses were graduates or non-graduates. And here's what they found. An increase in nurses' workload by one patient increased the likelihood of an inpatient dying within 30 days of admission by 70%. So they looked at the workload of nurses and found that fairly minor increases had a significant effect on patient mortality. However, every 10% increase in bachelor's degree nurses was associated with a decrease in this likelihood by 7%. In other words, the more graduate nurses there are compared with non-graduate nurses, the more likely the patients are to survive. And finally, these associations imply that patients in hospitals where 60% of nurses have a bachelor's degree and nurses cared for an average of 6 patients would have almost 30% lower mortality than patients in which only 30% of nurses had bachelor's degrees and nurses cared for an average of 8 patients. In other words, the fewer patients that nurses have to care for and the better educated the nurses are, and these are independent effects, these will increase the likelihood of patients surviving. I suppose the figures regarding the nurse-patient ratio aren't that surprising, and people would probably understand that. But I think for many people, the information about the level of graduate nursing education still comes as a surprise. Now, Linda Aiken supplied me with these particular graphs, which don't just show the percentages, they show the natural frequencies, and basically they show that as the nurse-patient ratio goes down, in other words, as nurses have fewer patients to look after, the survival nearly doubles between 14 to 4 patients per nurse. And also, as the percentage of graduate nurses goes up, the survival rate increases as well. The graph here shows death rates, but in the opposite direction is survival rate. The effect is quite marked. Now, these studies are general studies. They look at the number of graduates and the number of deaths, but they don't link them directly together. And that hadn't been done until very recently. So there's more evidence related to this. And it comes from a study which I had the privilege of being involved in Qatar, the effect of nurse graduateness on patient mortality, a cross-sectional survey. Now, this survey differs from the study in The Lancet, which is called the RN Forecast study, by the way. It differs from it. In this study, we were specifically able to link specific nurses to specific patients, because in this very large medical complex in Qatar, the nursing care is all recorded by means of a barcode belonging to the patient and a barcode belonging to the nurse. Every time a nurse administers care, they record both barcodes. So we could link specific nurses to specific patients. So this is not a general effect, this is a specific effect. What we found was quite simply, again, that the higher the level of bachelor's education or BSc education compared with non-BSc education led to a decline in patient mortality. Of course, the effect doesn't go on forever. We're not necessarily advocating that every nurse has to be a graduate. That would probably be a good thing, but we know that that might not be possible. However, if you want patients to survive more, you need to have more graduates. And again, this is the first study to link the two things together directly, and there is more work underway on this phenomenon. And I don't have the results to present so graphically, but another study related to this one that we also published looked at the nurse who was admitting the patient and whether the patient was more likely to survive. In other words, was the patient more likely to survive if they were admitted by a graduate or a non-graduate? And in fact, there's no effect there whatsoever. So it's not something to do with the initial contact or interaction between the patient and the nurse. It's to do with exposure to graduate nurse education. So that's the evidence regarding graduate nurse education. The message is quite simple. The more graduate nurses you have around, the more patients are likely to survive. There's a great deal more work to be done. This work is all done in acute areas. What we need to do is try to replicate this effect in community, primary care, and in other areas of the hospital. Of course, we have to be open to the fact that the effect may not be observed everywhere, but it's still worth studying, and it's still worth spreading the message that graduate nurse education, as far as we know, provides better care than non-graduate nurse education. That's my email. If you want to contact me, you can follow me on Twitter, and you can check out my own publications on ORCID. Thank you very much for listening.